In this section, we're going to learn how to create custom directives. Throughout most of this course, we've been creating custom components because they allow us to write reusable code. Along with components, we've been using directives to change how an element behaves. Directives can also be used to listen for events and binding attributes. Most of the directives that come from Vue are useful 95% of the time. The other 5% of the time, you may need to create a custom directive. Directives allow you to modify a small portion of an element without having to create a whole component. They're straightforward, but can be very powerful if used right. Custom directives can be registered globally or locally. We'll start by learning how to register them on a global level. Afterward, we'll look at local registration. Our first directive will be straightforward. We're going to create a directive that will render an icon. Sprinkled throughout the application are font awesome icons. It would be a good idea to create a directive that will inject an icon for us. The directive we'll create will be able to render an icon correctly for us. In the editor, create a folder inside the source directory called Directives. We're going to outsource the code into separate files. It's not required to register directives in separate files. This step is optional, but recommended for organization reasons. In the newly created folder, create a file called icon.js. Inside the file, we're going to export an object in the default namespace. The object we're exporting will be used for configuring the directive. Directives have lifecycle functions similar to components. There are 6 functions Vue will call whenever we use a directive in a template. They get called upon during different phases of the directive. The function that gets called will depend on what phase is currently occurring. Let's run through them. The first hook is called before mount. This hook will get called before the directive is mounted into the document. It's the very first hook that will get called in the entire life cycle of the directive. It'll only be called once. We can use it to do some preparation. The next hook is called mounted. This hook will run when the element has been added to the page. It's important to understand the difference between the before mount and mounted hooks. During the before mount hook, the element has not been added to the document even though the directive is loaded on the element. If you want to manipulate the element while it's on the page, you will want to use the mounted hook. Up next, we have the before update hook. Directives can experience updates similar to components. If a directive needs to be updated, this hook will be called before the update occurs. Afterward, we have the updated hook. It'll run when the element has been updated. For example, if you're using expressions or binding attributes on the element, and those get updated, you can expect this function to run. Next, there's the before unmount hook. Directives can be removed from the document. For example, let's say we were using a directive in a component that is being unmounted. The directive will also be unmounted. We can use this function to run some logic before the directive is unmounted. Lastly, we have the unmounted hook. This hook will run when the directive has been unmounted from the document. All 6 hooks are optional. You will most likely not use all of them unless you're creating a complex directive. Before we move on to using these functions, I want to go over the 4 arguments we'll encounter in any lifecycle functions. The first argument is called element, sometimes referred to as EL. This is the element in the document. The object will have the same properties and methods you would find on a JavaScript DOM object. You can change the stylings, inner content, etc. The next argument is called binding. This will hold the data that was added onto the directive. This argument includes the value and modifiers. You would use this object to give your directive more flexibility. We'll explore how to use this argument in a future lecture. Afterward, we have the vNode argument. This argument refers to the node in the virtual DOM. Vue will create a copy of the DOM called the virtual DOM. This argument is different from the element argument because the changes you make to it will not be reflected on the page. Both the binding and v-node arguments should be treated as read-only properties. Making modifications to these properties may not yield the desired results. There's one last argument that is only available to the before update and updated hooks. It's called previous node. This argument is the original node in the virtual DOM before the update occurred. You can use this to make comparisons to the updated node. Alright, we'll stop here for now. In the next one, we'll create our first directive.